Hi, I'm Gretchen LeBuhn from the Great Sunflower Project, and today I want to talk to you about how we're using community science to track nature. The talk's going to have three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science and how what our goals are for the science. Then I really want to talk about action and the challenges that we've had. Okay, since we're at the last talk of the day, I know that all of you know that there is good evidence that bee populations are declining. And this was the first time that the general public really got engaged with bees and pollinators. And for my family, it had a special resonance here. If you talk to most pollination biologists and you ask them to draw a map of the United States and identify the region that has the lowest or that has the worst pollinator service, I think you would have almost all of them would have a moment of panic because this is the map that would pop in their brain. It's really difficult to know where we have bees doing well and doing poorly. So when I say pollination service, what I'm talking about is the visitation rate, the transfer of pollen from one flower to another. At the Great Sunflower Project, we decided to focus on pollination services because they were much easier to measure than bee populations themselves. We don't have as many issues with identification, and it really gets at the heart of the matter. What are our pollinators? What services are our pollinators providing to agricultural plants, but also to our wild plants? So the Great Sunflower Project started with the idea that what we wanted to do was identify areas with poor pollination services. We started using an initial flower called the lemon queen sunflower. We've now expanded and collect data from any plant that people are interested in watching. And we have had over 100,000 people sign up. That doesn't mean they're all producing data. And we have data from over 3,000 sites across the United States. The project is really continental at scale. We have a number of participants from Canada and down into Mexico, and there are some international participants. The project itself is very simple. A typical user goes out, they watch a sunflower. We like them to use our lemon queen sunflower because then we know we're comparing apples to apples, but we do take data from all plants and are building up enough data on some common plants that we feel like we can really do something with that analysis. They tell us their site, the date, the number of flowers that they're watching, and their beginning and end time. We actually have some things built in our app, so these are automatically generated as someone steps through into the data collection program. And then they record what they see. So this person here, Dolores, saw 4 bees. She watched for 15 minutes. And so we convert that into our key metric, which is the bees per hour per flower, which is a measure of the pollination services at that site. And Dolores here had 16 bees per hour per flower. Well, with that metric, what we can do is look at pollination services across the United States. And we do this by geolocating those sites into an area. And you can see here, this is probably, or this site, Lovettsville, Virginia. It's embedded in agriculture. There are a certain number of roads. We can figure out what pesticide use is in this area, and we can start to do some really interesting science. We've done some things like this hotspot analysis where we looked for areas that were doing poorly. Those are indicated by the blue dots here. And we find that we had lower than expected pollination services down in this desert Southwest that may be attributable to drought, but also up through the Central Valley region of California. Interestingly, the Northeast did very well during this time period, and we're not completely sure why that is, whether it's the compression of the flowering season or the number of family gardens. We also have used these data to look at things like pesticides. This is the map of imidacloprid use back from 2009. And when we relate different neonicotinoid use to pollination services, we can see some really interesting things. So that's sort of the science background for what I, as a scientist, was interested in starting to collect data on pollination services. What's been more interesting to me is how this project has led to action. For many people who participated who had low pollination services, it was a moment of panic. They suddenly recognized that their backyard was not doing as well as they thought. Together with our participants, that meant that we realized we needed to develop a program, and we developed what we call the Great Habitat Challenge. The science outcome here is to try to identify, what do bees need to survive? Do they need water? Do they need more native plants? And the conservation outcome was to see whether or not, simply by providing some simple tools, we could get people to improve habitat. We began by doing some surveys about different things. And asking them, how hard is it for you to do this? How important do you think it is for pollinators? How likely are you to do this? And we did this for things like adding a nest block, making sure that you have some bare ground, switching over so you have more native plants. And this resulted in basically a checklist that people can go through and evaluate their property or their local park to see how well it's doing for pollinators. The interesting thing that we were excited about was that when we looked at whether or not people actually took action after going through the checklist, we found that absolutely 75% of the people who participated in going through the Great Habitat Challenge checklist actually took some actions to improve pollinator habitat. My take home from this is that simple tools can really lead to important behavior changes and conservation outcomes. We've just started really keeping track of how many hectares we've been able to support, and it's quite a few. Well, all of this has come with challenges. The first one I would say is funding. Running a community science project is free like puppies. And if you look at the amount of money spent and the amount of paid staff for the major community science programs, you can see that they're really substantial. Secondly, when you're dealing with volunteers, you have issues with keeping them engaged. And this is a typical pattern. We have someone collect some data, then they take a break, then they collect a lot of data, then they take a break. It's not uncommon for the participants to end up with incomplete time series, and just some issues with seasonality affect us because we're watching pollinators. We also see that there are regions of the country, particularly places with less density, that we have a hard time getting data from. And we know that there are unreliable data out there. For those of you who haven't noticed this before, this is actually a fly. It's not a bee. And then finally, it's sometimes hard to know what to do. So this is an example of a letter that we sent out to different participants to look at what increased retention. And so we had letters that said thank you. We had letters that promised them a gift of sunflower seeds and delivered. Some that asked people just to commit, which we called a promise, and some to give them additional tasks, because there was suggestion that keeping people engaged across time was really important for participation. And take a moment, think about, what do you think was most likely to increase participation? Here's what we found. Saying thank you reduced contributions by 60%. We do think that might have had something to do with starting a letter with thank you, because it feels like you're done. But the only thing that really helped was actually asking people to commit ahead of time, to clicking that link that said, yes, I will be participating next year. So I want to wrap up by talking about change, because I think that we're headed in a really interesting and new direction. I think there's been radical change with the advent of the Internet of Things. We all know that there is a sensor for almost everything out there. There are bees that are carrying tags to identify where they are. These are some bat calls. We have aerial photographs. We have sensors on trees. It's really phenomenal, the data that's coming in. There are projects like Fish Face run by the Nature Conservancy that are able to identify fish to species and allow fishermen to throw ones back over that are not the right species. So it's helping endangered species. What I'd really love to see is a way that we could develop a beeometer, some sort of sensor that would allow gardeners to set something out in their yard, and we could track what true pollination service is. Having said that, I think there's a cost to doing that type of work. I think that we have to be really thoughtful about what we do by taking advantage of sensor technology. So in this photograph here, the woman in the red vest, this is my Aunt Kitsy, and she's part of my typical user group. This is a garden club. She cares about her garden and her community. She's smart, engaged. She's a community leader. She's also chosen not to learn how to text. She lives in a small town in coastal Massachusetts where the types of action she can take to increase biodiversity might be convincing her garden club to plant natives, talking to her selectmen about banning pesticides, and working with school gardens. In fact, after collecting data on pollinators in her backyard through the Great Sunflower Project, she actually decided to plant a new pollinator garden. Now, Kitsy would be really happy to put a sensor in her backyard, but unless it's giving her something in return, she won't remember to reset it or change the batteries. And she might not have ever started to care about those pollinators if she hadn't had to look for them. So I think the key question for us is, how would you adapt all of this to your community? These are critical design elements of the brand new world. And I think technological design is proceeding so fast, we need to bring along our user groups. It might be that we need to create bee camps where people get cute pictures of their pollinators with identifications provided through imaging technology. Maybe it's truly a beeometer, or maybe it's just participating in the Great Sunflower Project as it is. What I'd like to end with is simply saying that if we're going to do informed conservation, we need scientific data. And data is often better than ideology if we're going to reach social consensus. I do think that by releasing the power of sensors and robotics while being mindful of the need to engage communities, we're going to find a future in which conservation is mainstream, it's economically attractive, and it's commonplace throughout the world. Join us.